German soldiers fought almost every kind of Allied formation in the Second World War. They fought professional regulars, reservists, colonial units, partisans, and elite troops. They learned quickly that fear was not a simple ranking of who was best. Fear came from something more specific, a pattern that got inside the body. The kind of opponent that didn't just win ground, but stole sleep. The kind of opponent that didn't just defend a line, but made the space in front of that line feel alive. The kind of opponent that turned darkness into a weapon and routine into a trap. In 1941, in the Mediterranean theater, the Australians earned exactly that kind of reputation, especially among units that came up against them in and around Tobruk, and later in the bitter chaos of Greece and Crete. Not because Australians had more tanks, not because they had more aircraft, often they had less, not because their uniforms were different, not because of slogans, but because of habits. Repeated habits, done night after night, until the enemy's imagination began doing half the work for them. The question behind this documentary is simple. Why did Germans sometimes describe Australians as uniquely unnerving, while often describing the British and Americans in a different emotional register? The answer is not that Germans didn't fear British or American power. Germans absolutely respected British artillery, British staying power, British discipline under fire, and the grim skill of British defenses. Germans feared American industrial scale, mobility, and air power, especially once the United States entered the war in full strength. But those were fears of weight and machinery. They were fears of being crushed. The fear Australians created in 1941 was often different. It was intimate. It was close. It was a fear of being touched in the dark. This begins in North Africa because North Africa makes fear easy to manufacture. The desert looks open and honest in daylight. At night, it becomes a liar. It becomes a place where distance disappears, where sound travels strangely, where the wind can hide a crawl, where a shallow depression becomes a trench, where wire becomes a maze, and where a single patrol can make a whole sector believe it is surrounded. The fortress port of Tobruk mattered because it was a lung. Whoever held it controlled breathing, supply, reinforcement, tempo. The Axis wanted it. The Allies refused to give it. Around 14,000 Australian soldiers became part of the garrison holding Tobruk during the siege in 1941, commanded by Leslie Morsehead. While the town was attacked and pressured by a German, Italian force under Erwin Rommel. The fighting wasn't only assaults. It was constant shelling and bombing, a long squeeze meant to break nerves and force surrender. And then, in the middle of all this, German propaganda tried to mock the defenders. Lord Haw-Haw called them rats. The defenders took the name and made it a badge, turning ridicule into identity. That matters because war isn't only killing. War is also storytelling. Whoever owns the story owns the morale. And in Tobruk, the defenders learned to own the insult. They didn't just survive inside holes. They came out of those holes at night and made the enemy regret every meter of sand. Fear spreads in armies the way cold spreads in winter. It begins with one man who had a bad night, then another. Then a whole platoon starts walking differently. Then officers begin changing routines. Then the enemy's tempo slows. That is the invisible victory, not a captured map, but a captured nervous system. To understand why Australians gained this reputation, you have to look at the methods that created it. Methods that were not unique inventions, but were used with a particular intensity and attitude. An aggressive, restless culture of patrolling and raiding, a refusal to sit passively under siege. A willingness to crawl for hours to kill or capture a few men, not for trophies but to send a message. You are not safe even when you think you are safe. And before Tobruk, there was Greece. Because the Australians who later fought in Tobruk came into that siege carrying the memory of something else the Germans had done in 1941. Fast, ruthless movement through the Balkans. The collapse of Greece, the desperate Allied withdrawal, and the bitter fight on Crete after the evacuation. In Greece and Crete, Australians learned what German operational speed felt like, how quickly positions could be turned, how quickly skies could fill with aircraft, how quickly plans could break. They learned to distrust assumptions. They learned that survival belonged to the force that adapted fastest. The Germans, in turn, learned something about Australians, that when the situation became desperate, Australians could become dangerous in ways that didn't always fit neat doctrine. So this documentary is not a simple claim that Australians were braver. Bravery is everywhere in war. This is a claim that in key moments in 1941, Greece, Crete, Tobruk, Australians produced a distinct psychological pressure on German troops because they fought the close war, the war of night patrols, wire trenches, sudden raids, and uncertainty. The kind of war that doesn't show up in big arrows on a map. The kind of war that shows up in the way a man's hands shake when he tries to light a cigarette in the dark. In early 1941, the German war machine did what it was designed to do. It moved faster than plans could breathe. Greece became a place where maps changed by the hour, where roads became choke points, and where retreat wasn't a failure of courage, it was a requirement for survival. Australians entered Greece as part of a coalition trying to slow a force that didn't just attack positions, but attacked time itself. For German soldiers, Greece was not fought as a slow grind. It was fought as a succession of collapses and sudden turns, positions threatened by flanking movement, withdrawal orders arriving late, convoys jammed on narrow roads, and aircraft overhead turning daylight into a liability. The psychological weight of German air power mattered here as much as German infantry and armor. It shrank the world. It forced movement into the night. It punished anything that looked like a line. Australians in Greece were often not trying to win in the conventional sense. They were trying to delay long enough for evacuation to be possible. That creates a specific kind of battlefield behavior: rearguards blocking positions, sudden stands, then fast disappearances before the trap closes. It is not glamorous fighting. It is hard fighting because it demands two opposite skills at once. You must look strong enough to stop the enemy while knowing you cannot stay. That is where reputations begin to form, not only from what you do when you advance, but from what you do when you withdraw. Withdrawals can look like weakness, but disciplined withdrawals, fought in fragments, can feel to the attacker like running into a series of clenched fists that keep appearing at the worst moments. In the Greek campaign, Australians found themselves in the narrow geography that makes delaying actions terrifying for both sides. Passes, ridgelines, and roads through mountainous terrain create forced movement. When a defender holds a pass, the attacker cannot simply spread out and go around without paying in time. Germans were masters at finding ways around, but every way around still had to be paid for in reconnaissance, in fuel, in coordination, and often in blood. And the moment the attacker senses delay, impatience grows. Impatience creates mistakes, and mistakes are the only gift a weaker force can count on. This is important because it shaped what Australians learned about Germans, and what Germans learned about Australians. Germans learned that Australian units could be stubborn in the moments that mattered, even when the larger situation was already decided. Australians learned that Germans were not simply good fighters, but an engine of speed, an enemy whose real advantage was tempo. That lesson would become crucial later, when Australians faced Germans in a very different environment where tempo could be manipulated. Tobruk. When evacuation began, it did not feel like a clean exit. It felt like a race with the enemy's shadow. Troops moved toward ports and beaches under pressure, with equipment left behind and fatigue turning discipline into something that had to be forced. Australians and other Allied troops boarded ships and left Greece, but they did not leave the war behind. They carried the psychological residue, the sound of aircraft, the sense of being hunted by a force that could appear behind you, the awareness that modern war could make you feel surrounded, even in open country. Then they landed on Crete. Crete was supposed to be a pause. It became a trap. Thousands of exhausted troops arrived with limited heavy weapons, limited transport, and limited time to prepare. The island had mountains, olive groves, dry riverbeds, and coastlines that could feel like escape routes, until they didn't. Germans came from the air. That was the shock. Paratroopers dropping into a defended island created a different kind of fear. The fear that the battlefield can form behind you instantly. For Australian defenders, the first hours of the airborne assault had an uncanny quality. You could hear aircraft, then see parachutes, then watch armed men descending into your world as if gravity itself had chosen sides. The fighting that followed could be brutal and close, because airborne troops, once scattered, have to gather themselves under fire. That creates pockets of chaos, small fights, sudden charges, confused lines. It is the kind of combat where individual initiative matters more than perfect plans. Germans learned something on Crete that is often overlooked. Airborne victories can be paid for at a horrifying cost when defenders refuse to panic. And Australians, fighting in that fractured environment, built another layer of their reputation. Not only stubborn defense, but sudden violent counteraction when the moment opened. Crete also taught Australians something that would later shape Tobruk. When you lack equipment, you cannot afford waste. When you lack air cover, you cannot afford daytime exposure. When you are short on transport, you cannot rely on easy movement. You must master the small war, concealment, night movement, patience, and raids that target the enemy's weak posture instead of his strong posture. By the time the struggle in Greece and Crete ended in evacuation and captivity for many, Australians had been forced into an accelerated education. They had seen what German operational excellence looked like at full speed. They had also seen where German systems were vulnerable, in the gaps between units, in confusion, in night uncertainty, and in situations where defenders fought in ways that didn't match German expectations. That brings us back to Tobruk, where Germans arrived with confidence and a plan. A fortress, once surrounded, should wither. A garrison should shrink into passivity. A besieged force should become predictable. The Australians in Tobruk would refuse to be predictable. Before we go there fully, it's important to understand the mental state of a soldier who has survived Greece and then finds himself inside a ring of fire in Libya. He is tired. He is angry. He has watched retreats and evacuations. He has heard bombs too close for too long. He is not romantic about war anymore. If you want to survive a siege after that kind of campaign, you need something stronger than optimism. You need a doctrine that turns fear outward. In Tobruk, that doctrine would take a very simple form. The idea that defense is not sitting still. Defense is reaching out. Defense is making the enemy feel as besieged as you are. Defense is owning the night so completely that the attacker starts to dread the hours when the sun goes down. That is where German fear begins to change shape, from fear of Allied mass to fear of Allied presence, from fear of being crushed to fear of being touched. Tobruk was supposed to be a simple military problem. Surround the port, cut it off, pound it from the air and with artillery, probe for weak points. Eventually, the defenders run out of food, water, ammunition, and hope. That is what sieges are designed to do. They replace the uncertainty of battle with the certainty of time. But Tobruk did not behave like a normal siege. It became a war of nerves, and the Australians inside it helped redesign the rules. The first reason is geography and supply. Tobruk was not just a dot on a map, it was a deep-water harbor. If the Axis could take it, their logistics would breathe easier. If the Allies could hold it, Rommel's forces would have to drag supplies over long desert distances instead of unloading them close to the front. That made Tobruk feel like a locked door the Axis had to open. It also made Tobruk a symbol. If it held, the myth of unstoppable momentum cracked. So the Axis did what a besieging force always does. They attacked the body, shelling, bombing, pressure, repeated assaults. The defenders lived under almost constant disturbance. The sky became an enemy in itself. In the desert, there is nowhere to hide from noise except underground. Men learned to sleep in shallow dugouts and rock hollows, waking at every change in sound. The taste of dust became permanent. The sensation of grit and teeth became normal. The mind adapted, but only by shrinking. In a siege, your world becomes a few yards of trench and the strip of sky above it. This is where propaganda entered. A German broadcaster, Lord Haw-Haw, mocked the defenders as rats, meaning creatures trapped in holes waiting to be smoked out. The insult was meant to reduce them psychologically. You are cornered, you are vermin, you are already dead. But the defenders took the word and inverted it. They embraced it, not as a confession of weakness, but as a statement of survival. If the enemy called them rats, then rats would become predators of the night. This matters because names in war become instructions. Once you wear a name, you begin to fight like it. The second reason Tobruk became different is command philosophy. Under Leslie Morsehead, the garrison did not treat defense as passivity. The idea was simple. If the enemy is comfortable, you are losing. If the enemy is resting, he is recovering strength. If the enemy can build routine, he can build confidence. Therefore, the defenders had to deny routine. That denial took the shape of patrolling. Patrolling sounds small compared to artillery and tanks, but in Tobruk it became a psychological industry. It was not just reconnaissance. It was harassment. It was theft of sleep. It was a constant reminder that the wire did not protect you, and darkness did not belong to you. The Australians didn't simply wait for the next bombardment. They crawled out into the space between lines and made that space theirs. In daylight, Tobruk was a fortress under punishment. At night, Tobruk became an animal that left its burrow and hunted. This is the heart of the German fear. Not fear of being outgunned. Germans expected danger. It was fear of being intruded upon. Fear that the perimeter you believed you controlled was actually controlled by the men inside the fortress. Fear that the besiegers were, in a strange way, being besieged back. The night war had its own physics. Sand holds sound differently. Wire sings when touched. A careless boot scuffs stone. A cough becomes a flare in the dark. So the men who moved out at night learned a discipline that modern soldiers would recognize instantly. Slow movement, controlled breathing, long pauses. Listening posts that weren't just posts but traps. There is a certain kind of terror that comes when you are a sentry and you realize you are not listening for footsteps anymore. You are listening for the absence of normal desert noises. Because when the desert goes quiet, when insects stop, when wind shifts, your body tells you something is close. The fear doesn't start when bullets fly. It starts when the world changes tone. In the space between the lines, the Australians began doing things that looked irrational to anyone who thought defense was static. They raided. They ambushed. They captured prisoners. They attacked outposts. They hit working parties. They made the enemy feel that every task, repairing wire, moving supplies, setting mines, adjusting positions, could be punished without warning. A siege is supposed to make defenders smaller. Tobruk's defenders used the siege to make themselves larger at night. And this is where German psychology begins to split between different kinds of opponents. Germans fighting the British in set-piece conditions could expect a certain rhythm: artillery, coordinated attacks, and a measured, methodical tempo. Germans fighting Americans later could fear overwhelming scale and speed of resupply and air power. But in Tobruk, Germans faced something that felt more primitive and more personal. Men crawling toward them in darkness, not to take a city, but to take their sense of safety. A fortress can be hammered, but a mind can be exhausted, and exhaustion is contagious. German soldiers in siege positions rely on the idea that they are the hunters. They have surrounded prey. They are tightening the ring. They are the ones who choose when to assault. Patrolling flips that assumption. Patrolling tells the besieging soldier, you are not the only one deciding when violence happens. And once that belief sets in, the body changes. Soldiers start firing at shadows. They start wasting flares. They start overreacting. They start sleeping in shorter bursts. They start seeing threat in the wrong places, which makes them miss it in the right places. A unit that sleeps poorly makes poorer decisions. A unit that makes poorer decisions suffers more losses. Losses confirm fear. Fear amplifies mistakes. The loop feeds itself. The Axis attempted to break Tobruk with assaults and air attacks, but the night war kept sabotaging the besiegers' sense of control. That's why Tobruk became more than a port. It became a moral contest. The defenders were supposed to accept being trapped. Instead, they behaved as if the enemy had made a mistake by coming close enough to be touched. Inside Tobruk, living conditions were brutal. The sea link that kept the garrison alive, the Tobruk ferry, ran under threat. Ships were lost. Men watched smoke on the horizon and understood that survival had a naval price as well as a ground price. The fortress was not a comfortable stronghold. It was a place that demanded stubbornness every hour. And yet the defenders' story kept growing because they refused to let suffering turn into passivity. German propaganda calling them rats unintentionally highlighted the very thing that made them dangerous. Rats do not fight like lions in open fields. Rats fight in tunnels, in darkness, in close places, in ways that feel dirty and unsettling. By embracing the insult, the defenders embraced a psychological identity that matched the conditions of siege warfare. So when German soldiers spoke about Australians with a particular tone, it often came back to this feeling. The Australians did not merely hold, they reached out. They made the besiegers pay for being close. This is the moment when the documentary's central explanation becomes clear. Germans could respect British discipline and American power, but Australians in Tobruk developed a reputation for something that lands in the nervous system. Relentless night activity, aggressive patrol culture, and a refusal to accept the role the enemy assigned them. A siege is supposed to make you quiet. In Tobruk, it made the Australians louder in the only way that mattered, not by radio, not by speeches, but by presence in the dark. A siege is supposed to be a math problem. The attacker has more freedom of movement. The defender is trapped. Time is on the attacker's side. Tobruk broke that math by changing what time meant. The Australians inside the perimeter treated time as something that could be spent offensively, night after night, until the besieging force began paying interest in exhaustion. The mechanism was patrolling, but not as an occasional scouting effort. Patrolling became a system, a nightly industry, a kind of battlefield economy where the defenders purchased long-term advantage using the currency of fatigue and risk. The goal was never heroic raids for their own sake. The goal was a steady, grinding theft, stealing the enemy's certainty, stealing his rest, stealing his sense of control over the ground he believed he owned. To understand why this created fear, imagine the life of a besieging soldier around Tobruk. Daylight is loud. Artillery and aircraft dominate. The desert sun turns every surface into glare. The soldier tells himself a story to survive. The defenders are trapped. They are suffering more than we are. They will eventually crack. At night, that soldier should be able to recover. He should be able to relax into routine. He should be able to believe that the wire and mines and listening posts create a safe boundary. The Australians attacked that belief. They did it by making the space between lines, no man's land, feel like it belonged to the defenders. That is psychologically humiliating for a besieging force. A siege is an assertion of dominance. If the besieged can move freely at night, the siege begins to feel like theater. The patrol economy worked through several repeating patterns. First pattern, the slow approach. Not a sprinting assault, not cinematic charges, but crawling, pausing, listening, moving again. Sand and rock are different teachers. Sand can swallow sound if you move correctly, but it can also betray you with a single scrape on stone or a clink of metal. Wire is a musical instrument in the dark. Touch it wrong and it sings. So the men who patrolled learned to become careful in ways that make the war feel old, almost primitive. They learned that the enemy's best sensor at night was not always a machine. It was fear. A frightened man hears more, but he also imagines more. The trick is to push him into imagination while staying real. Second pattern, the sudden strike. Most patrols did not exist to start a large battle. They existed to create a brief, violent moment and then vanish. The best night raid is one that forces the enemy to react too late, in the wrong direction, with the wrong weight. It is an act that does not merely kill, it creates confusion. Confusion is a multiplier. Confusion spreads, and it makes commanders conservative, which slows operations and traps units into predictable behavior. Predictable behavior can be exploited again. Third pattern, the prisoner. In a conventional story of war, prisoners are a byproduct. In a siege patrol economy, prisoners are a resource. A captured man can reveal unit identifications, routine changes, wire layouts, minefield lanes, ration patterns, and command relationships. Even if he reveals nothing, his disappearance creates a disturbance. He was there at last light. He was gone at dawn. His friends search for him and lose confidence. His unit tightens security and becomes less flexible. The besiegers begin devoting manpower to guarding themselves instead of pressing the siege. That shift is exactly what the defenders want. Fourth pattern, the harassment of work. Sieges require labor. Wire must be repaired. Mines must be laid. Guns must be repositioned. Supplies must be moved. Latrines must be dug. Posts must be reinforced. The Australians learned that the enemy doing work is the enemy vulnerable. Heads down, hands occupied, attention divided. A raid that hits a working party does more than inflict casualties. It teaches the besieging soldier that even basic survival tasks can be punished. Once that lesson is internalized, the besieger's world becomes smaller. He moves less. He does less. He waits more. A besieging force that waits more is a besieging force losing its initiative. Fifth pattern, the ritual of unpredictability. Fear does not require constant contact. Fear requires uncertainty about when contact will happen. If raids happen every night at the same hour, the enemy adapts. If raids are irregular, sometimes at midnight, sometimes before dawn, sometimes after days of quiet, the enemy cannot form a stable rhythm. He stays on edge every night. Edge becomes exhaustion. Exhaustion becomes mistakes. Mistakes become casualties. Casualties validate fear. This is why the Australian approach in Tobruk became so psychologically potent. It didn't rely on one brilliant operation. It relied on repetition. Repetition is what rewires the enemy's behavior. A single raid is an incident. A month of raids is a condition. And it wasn't only what the Australians did at night. It was what they refused to do during the day. They refused to waste strength chasing dramatic fights when air power and artillery could punish exposure. They conserved energy for the hours when their method mattered most. That kind of discipline feels like cunning to the enemy. Cunning is frightening because it suggests intention, and intention suggests that your enemy is not reacting. he is choosing. The propaganda nickname rats also played into this. The word carries a certain disgust. It implies a creature that survives in the dark, that comes out when you think you are alone, that slips into your space and takes what it wants. By embracing the name, the defenders unconsciously adopted its logic: survival through underground resilience and offense through nocturnal reach. The nickname became a psychological mirror held up to the besiegers. The enemy said rats to shame them. The defenders said rats to promise them something worse: nights without rest. There is another element that deepened German fear: professional pride. German troops were trained to believe in their own competence. Many had experienced rapid victories. They believed they understood how a siege should unfold. When a besieged garrison begins dominating the night, it is not only dangerous, it is insulting. Insult is fuel. It drives retaliation. Retaliation can become reckless. Recklessness can be used against you. In a siege, the side that loses emotional control often loses tactical discipline. The Australians used that dynamic without needing to announce it. They didn't need speeches. They didn't need posters. They needed only to keep crawling out beyond their wire and making the enemy ask the same question every night: where are they now? This is what made the fear different from other kinds of fear Germans felt in the war. British and later American power could make Germans fear daylight destruction, artillery, air strikes, massed attack. But Tobruk's patrol economy created fear of darkness itself, fear of stillness, fear of the moment when the desert wind changed and a sentry suddenly felt, without evidence, that he was being watched. By late in a long siege, that feeling becomes self-sustaining. Even on nights when nothing happens, the enemy still braces. He still sleeps lightly. He still burns flares at shadows. He still wastes energy. That is victory achieved without firing a shot. But the Australians did fire sometimes. They killed, they captured, they raided. They paid for this night dominance with blood and exhaustion of their own. The difference is that they paid by choice, under conditions they shaped, rather than paying as passive victims of siege pressure. That is the heart of the psychological lesson. A defender who reaches out at night forces the attacker to defend himself. Once the attacker is defending himself, the siege stops being a one-way squeeze and becomes a mutual grind. Mutual grind favors the side with better morale and tighter discipline. In Tobruk, the defenders' morale became a weapon because it was anchored in identity, the idea that they were not trapped prey. They were stubborn, sarcastic survivors who could turn an insult into a flag and a siege into an opportunity to strike back. Rommel's forces did not arrive at Tobruk thinking in poetry. They arrived thinking in distance, supply, fuel, and time. North Africa is an arithmetic theater. A commander can be brilliant and still lose to logistics. A battalion can be brave and still be useless if it runs out of water. A tank can be lethal and still become scrap if it can't be fed fuel and parts. In that environment, Tobruk wasn't symbolic first. It was practical. It was a port that could either shorten Axis supply lines or stretch them into exhaustion. That practical reality is what made Tobruk so hard to ignore. When a port like that stays in enemy hands, it doesn't just deny supplies. It forces a commander to allocate troops and attention to a problem that never stops existing. It's a thorn that keeps drawing blood. Tobruk compelled pressure. Pressure compelled assaults. Assaults compelled losses. And losses are the one thing that can puncture even a confident army's mood. The defenders inside Tobruk were not only Australian, but the Australians formed the backbone of the garrison in the period that built the fortress's reputation. The siege was not a single continuous stand and hold. It was a cycle: attacks, bombardments, probing, regrouping. And then the night war, patrols and raids that refused to let the attacker own the tempo. The same place that looked trapped on a map behaved like a moving organism after dark. And that is the part that created the strange emotional mix on the Axis side. Frustration, respect, and a growing dislike for the hours between sunset and sunrise. Because daylight belonged largely to the attackers' machines, aircraft and artillery could make any movement painful. Daylight punished silhouettes, punished vehicles, punished gathering, punished anything that looked like a target. The defenders learned to survive by becoming small in daylight. That's what a siege teaches you. Then night arrived and the defenders became large again. From the Axis perspective, that inversion is maddening. In a clean siege narrative, the attacker controls initiative. The attacker decides when to escalate. The attacker chooses when to test the wire. The attacker chooses when to launch an assault. The defender is reactive. But the Australians and other defenders built a habit of reversing initiative at the small unit level. They treated the night as their own operational window, an 8-hour period where aircraft advantage diminished and where the besiegers' confidence could be cut apart by sudden violence. This is how fear becomes more than respect. Respect is rational. You assess the enemy's capability. Fear is bodily. You begin anticipating pain before it arrives. You begin living in the future tense. In Tobruk, German troops began to anticipate the night as a time when the enemy might appear in places the wire was supposed to prevent. That anticipation forces posture changes, more sentries, more alert cycles, more flares, more jumpiness. Every posture change costs manpower and rest. Every night of poor rest makes the next day worse. That's how a fortress begins weakening an army outside it, not by a breakthrough, but by attrition of nerves. Propaganda tried to seize this narrative and control it. Calling the defenders rats was meant to reduce them. Yet it also revealed something. The attacker understood the defenders were hard to dislodge and were surviving in holes. The defenders embraced the insult and made it into an identity. In doing so, they got something that is rare in a siege, an upward morale curve. A siege is supposed to slowly grind morale down. In Tobruk, morale didn't stay high because life was easy. Morale stayed high because the defenders had a story that matched the conditions. A rat survives. A rat bites. A rat comes out at night. A rat is difficult to predict. And the propaganda didn't stop at rats. The same broadcaster also mocked the Australian commander, with names meant to frame the garrison as bandits rather than soldiers. That kind of propaganda only works if the target becomes embarrassed. The Australians did the opposite. They turned mockery into fuel. The insult became proof that the enemy was watching them closely enough to bother. Now, from the Axis side, leadership also faced a strategic frustration. Tobruk wasn't only a fortress, it was a magnet for resources. Men and guns devoted to maintaining the siege weren't available elsewhere. The longer the siege dragged on, the more it threatened the tempo of Axis operations. And that pressure can lead commanders to attempt decisive solutions. Decisive solutions in siege warfare often mean major assaults. Major assaults against a prepared garrison are expensive. Expensive assaults create casualty lists. Casualty lists create resentment among troops, especially if the same objective keeps refusing to fall. This is where the Australians' night war paid a second dividend. Major assaults require preparation, reconnaissance, positioning, engineer work, assembling assault groups, and establishing routes through obstacles. Night raiding and aggressive patrolling interfered with that preparation. It forced the besiegers to work under threat. It forced them to allocate additional security. It disrupted the calm, repetitive labor that siege success depends on. A siege without steady preparation is a siege that becomes just bombardment. And bombardment alone rarely solves a determined defense unless supplies are fully cut. But supplies were not fully cut. The garrison's link to the outside world ran across the sea, the so-called Tobruk ferry. It was not safe. Ships were lost. Yet the connection existed long enough to keep Tobruk alive during the period that mattered most. That meant Rommel's forces faced an opponent that did not starve quickly and did not sit quietly. Inside the perimeter, the defenders were paying their own costs. Their casualties were real. Their suffering was constant. Their dugouts were cramped. Their water was limited. Their sleep was broken by shells, bombs, and alarms. And yet, for German soldiers outside, what mattered was that the defenders did not behave like men who were running out of hope. They behaved like men who had decided they would be dangerous even if they were doomed. That posture is terrifying because it cannot be easily negotiated with. It isn't a posture of surrender. It isn't even a posture of "we will win." It is a posture of "you will pay." A siege turns into a moral contest when one side refuses to accept the role the other side assigns. The Axis wanted the defenders to be trapped prey. The defenders refused. They didn't just wait for the next assault. They reached out, captured men, dragged them back through the wire, left the besiegers to explain disappearances in the morning. They struck outposts, vanished, and made retaliation difficult because the attackers could not always locate them in daylight. At some point, a German soldier stops asking, "When will we take Tobruk?" and begins asking, "Will we make it through tonight?" That is the shift from strategic thinking to bodily fear. And it spreads through units faster than orders can correct it. This is the moment where the title of your documentary becomes understandable in a non-mythic way. Germans feared Australians in Tobruk, not because Australians were the only dangerous soldiers on Earth, but because in that environment, the Australians specialized in the kind of war that most directly attacks the mind: night dominance, aggressive patrolling, and unpredictable raids that created a sense of constant vulnerability. Now the story must widen again, because Tobruk alone is not enough. The reputation wasn't built only by what Australians did to Germans in Libya. It was reinforced by what happened earlier in Greece, and especially on Crete, where German paratroopers encountered a different kind of brutality: close-range fighting in olive groves and creek beds, hard resistance that inflicted heavy losses, and a battlefield where the Germans were the ones feeling hunted in pockets. The next part shifts back across the Mediterranean to Crete, not to retell the whole campaign, but to show how German troops experienced Australian resistance there, and how that experience rhymed with Tobruk's lesson. Fear is born when the enemy refuses to break and then comes for you up close. Crete did not begin as a carefully prepared last stand. It began as an aftershock. German and Italian forces overran Greece in April 1941, and exhausted Allied troops flowed out of the mainland's collapse toward the island. Many arrived tired, under-equipped and short of heavy weapons. The island's defenses were stretched around key points, airfields and ports, because everyone understood the central truth of Crete: whoever controlled the airfields could control reinforcement, and whoever controlled reinforcement could control the island. The defenders had numbers, but the attackers had something that can erase numbers: air supremacy and the ability to move men and supplies through the sky. The German assault was not built like a conventional invasion, where front lines advanced like a tide. It began with aircraft and parachutes, German airborne troops dropping into the defenders, whirled in daylight under fire, scattered across olive groves, creek beds, towns, and airfield approaches. That method produces a unique kind of battlefield emotion on both sides. For the defender, it feels surreal. Enemies appear from above, as if the sky itself has chosen a side. For the attacker, it feels like a gamble. Men fall dispersed, and the first minutes decide whether they gather into combat units or die as isolated groups. One Australian officer, Ralph Honor of the 211th Battalion, described watching the paratroopers descend near Rethymno as something that might have belonged to a war between the planets, with parachutes like silken mushrooms, lowering men into consuming fire until the sky filled with futuristic snowflakes beneath aircraft flashing into fire from the ground. It's a description that captures what made Crete psychologically violent: the mix of spectacle and intimacy, mass movement in the air, but then close-range fighting when scattered groups hit the ground. The German paratroopers were highly trained and motivated, but Crete turned training into exhaustion fast. The fighting became savage and close, with little clean distance between opponents. Bodies lay in streets and among olive trees and creek beds, and even decades later veterans remembered the smell of death as something you could taste, because close combat does that. It turns war into something physical that follows you home. This is the key point for your video's theme. German fear of Australians was not always about being outgunned. In Crete, it could be about being met with a kind of resistance that refused to behave like a shocked defender. The paratroopers expected confusion to buy them time. In many areas, they found defenders who reacted fast, used camouflage, and counterattacked when opportunities appeared. The defenders denied the attackers easy control of key objectives in several sectors, even as the Germans' logistical and air advantages ultimately overwhelmed them. As the battle expanded, the German strategy focused on the points that mattered: the airfield at Maleme and the ports and hubs around Kenya and Suda. New Zealand forces held the western sector with Australian, British, and Greek support. In the center, British units held Heraklion with some Australian and Greek forces. 4 Australian battalions and artillery held the corridor between Georgiopolis and Rethymno, backed by Greek units and local police. The defense was spread thin, and without air cover, daylight became an enemy. That forced a pattern the Australians were already learning in 1941. Survive the day, fight your best fight in the hours where the enemy's advantages shrink. In the Rethymno and Heraklion sectors, the Germans were pushed back from some immediate objectives and denied quick airfield control. But the defenders were isolated from each other and could not support neighboring sectors. At Maleme, the Germans captured the airfield and used it to fly in reinforcements, transforming a risky airborne drop into a sustainable invasion. Once that happened, the battle's outcome tilted, because the airfield became a door that wouldn't close. By late May, the defenders' situation collapsed into the classic nightmare of an army without air superiority: ammunition shortages, thin food, limited transport, broken communications, and enemy aircraft dominating daylight. Retreat and evacuation became the only option. The forces around Suda withdrew across the island toward Esfakia on the south coast. Heraklion was abandoned, and at Rethymno, Australian units that had fought hard to deny the airstrip were cut off. Evacuation ships could take only so many, leaving thousands behind to face capture or attempt escape into mountains with local help. Here's why this matters to the fear question. When Germans win a battle cleanly, when the enemy collapses quickly, the winner's emotions are often simple: confidence, superiority, maybe contempt. Crete was not a clean win. It was a costly win, fought in pockets, with savage close-range action, and it left behind an aftertaste. These defenders do not break the way they should. That aftertaste becomes respect. In the wrong conditions, respect becomes caution. In the wrong conditions, caution becomes fear. And Crete created one more ingredient: the hunt. After organized resistance broke down, Germans hunted small groups of Allied soldiers trying to evade capture. Those groups, Australian, New Zealand, British, and others, often hid in mountains and moved at night, sometimes helped by locals who risked death for assisting them. That kind of post-battle stalking war changes how soldiers think. It turns warfare into man-to-man uncertainty. It reinforces a lesson Germans had already been learning in Tobruk's night war. Even when you hold the skies, the ground can still betray you after dark. So Crete feeds directly into the Australian reputation. It shows Australians as defenders who could fight brutally in close terrain, who could deny objectives locally even when strategically doomed, and who could continue resisting as scattered groups rather than dissolving psychologically. Now we return to Tobruk with a sharper lens, because Tobruk wasn't only a siege. It was the continuation of the same truth that Crete exposed. In 1941, the most psychologically damaging thing you could do to an enemy was not always to defeat him quickly. It was to make every step feel unsafe, every night feel watched, and every victory feel expensive. Next, we connect these two storylines, Crete's close-range savagery and Tobruk's night patrol economy, into the exact mechanism of fear, how Germans begin changing behavior, how rumors spread, how units become tense, and how a reputation becomes a battlefield weapon all by itself. Fear in war doesn't usually arrive as a single moment. It accumulates. It forms the way rust forms, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once you realize the metal is weaker than it looked. In 1941, Germans fighting Australians in the Mediterranean theater encountered a specific kind of accumulation, not just hard fighting in set-piece moments, but a steady pattern of resistance that infected the enemy's expectations. At the center of that pattern was a psychological inversion. In conventional thinking, the attacker hunts and the defender hides. In Tobruk, the besiegers expected the garrison to shrink into its trenches, to wait for the next bombardment, to conserve itself like a candle burning down. Instead, the defenders behaved like the night belonged to them. They didn't use darkness as cover only. They used it as territory. They treated the hours after sunset as operational space where the enemy could be touched. Once that happens a few times, the enemy's mental map changes. A German sentry begins his shift, assuming danger exists only in front of the wire. After enough nights of patrol pressure, he begins assuming danger exists everywhere. On the wire, under the wire, behind the wire, in the dead space his unit never watches properly. That shift matters more than any single casualty count, because once a soldier believes danger is everywhere, he begins spending energy constantly, even when nothing is happening. And that constant spending is what breaks units over time. This is how the Australians became more than a unit label in some sectors. It became a warning. Not because Germans believed Australians were supernatural, but because the behavior pattern was so consistent that it felt inevitable. If you let your guard down, they would appear. If you grew comfortable, they would punish it. If you believed the siege had turned them passive, they would prove you wrong after midnight. In Tobruk, that reputation was fed by three interlocking mechanisms. The first mechanism was the patrol itself, not as a rare event, but as routine aggression. Patrolling created the sense that no man's land was not empty, but occupied. A patrol doesn't need to be large to change behavior. It only needs to be believable. A small patrol that consistently returns with prisoners, information, or proof of intrusion forces the enemy to adjust in ways that are out of proportion to the patrol's size. That is the hidden efficiency of night warfare. One action creates 10 reactions. The second mechanism was the way the defenders used silence. Many soldiers understand silence as not being loud. Tobruk taught a more advanced lesson. Silence is a weapon because it makes the enemy's imagination work against him. Loud attacks give the enemy something concrete to react to. Silent attacks give him nothing but consequences. When a listening post disappears, when a working party is hit quickly and the attackers vanish, when wire is found cut and no one knows when it happened, the enemy begins filling the gaps with fear. Fear always adds extra enemy strength in the mind. A patrol of 8 becomes a platoon in rumor. A raid by a dozen becomes a company in the story that spreads down the trench. The third mechanism was the insult that backfired. The Rats label gave the defenders a character they leaned into: nocturnal, stubborn, hard to kill, and willing to bite. Even if a German soldier never heard the broadcast himself, the concept traveled. And concepts in war can be as heavy as ammunition because they change posture. The more the defender owns the insult, the more the attacker feels as if he helped build the legend he now has to fight. This is why reputation can become a force multiplier. It is not mystical. It is behavioral economics. Reputation forces the enemy to overinvest in security. Overinvestment bleeds manpower. It slows tempo. It creates hesitation. It changes what commanders believe is possible. It changes the willingness of units to take initiative after dark. An initiative in a siege is the most precious thing there is. The same psychological principle appeared in Crete, but in a different form. Crete created a memory for German airborne troops and mountain troops that did not feel like a clean victory. It felt like winning a fight in a room full of broken furniture, sharp edges everywhere, bodies everywhere, and no sense of control until the very end. Even after organized resistance broke, the island remained dangerous because small groups escaped into the mountains and continued moving with local help. That meant German troops on Crete learned that even when you win, you might still spend weeks hunting men who refuse to accept defeat. That kind of after-battle pursuit is exhausting, and exhaustion breeds respect. Respect breeds caution, and caution, when combined with uncertainty, can begin to resemble fear. Now connect the two theaters. Tobruk and Crete are different landscapes, but they teach the same emotional lesson. The most unnerving enemy is not necessarily the one with the biggest guns. The most unnerving enemy is the one who keeps operating when you expect him to stop. This is where Germans often described British and Americans differently. In many German accounts and memories, British power felt methodical and structured. Heavy weapons, disciplined defense, set-piece operations, a professional rhythm. American power later felt enormous. Relentless supply, huge firepower, air dominance, industrial volume that could absorb losses and keep coming. Those forces could terrify, but they were terrors of scale, terrors you could see. Australians in Tobruk produced a terror you could feel in the spine without seeing it, the terror of proximity. The terror that the enemy might be 5 meters away, crawling, while you stare into darkness that looks empty. The terror that a war you thought was big and mechanical has become small and personal. And here is the most important point. That terror did not require constant fighting. The Australians didn't have to raid successfully every night to own the night. They only had to make the enemy believe that any quiet night could be the night something happens. That belief forces the enemy to live under tension continuously. Continuous tension is a slow injury. It does not bleed, but it kills judgment. This is why the fear story becomes credible without exaggeration. We don't need mythic claims that Germans were terrified of Australians in every circumstance. We only need to explain how certain Australian behaviors in 1941, especially aggressive patrolling and night raids in Tobruk, and close-range resistance in Crete, created a distinctive psychological pressure that German troops remembered. Now the documentary must deal with the hardest truth. Reputation is never free. The patrol economy costs lives. It costs stamina. It costs men who go out into darkness and do not return. A unit that dominates the night does so by paying in risk. Tobruk's defenders bled. Crete's defenders were killed and captured. In Greece, rearguards paid in exhaustion and casualties to buy time for evacuations. The reputation was forged from that price. So the real meaning of fear here is not that Germans thought Australians were monsters. It is that Germans recognized a particular style, stubborn defense combined with aggressive night action, creating a battlefield where rest was denied and certainty was stolen. And that sets up the final act of this documentary, what happened after 1941. How the siege ended, what the legend did to Allied morale, what it did to German expectations in the Desert War, and why these events still matter as a lesson about how small unit behavior can change a campaign's emotional reality. A siege ends in one of three ways. The defenders surrender, the defenders are destroyed, or the siege is lifted because the larger war moves and the ring breaks. Tobruk did not end with a clean surrender, and it did not end with the fortress simply being taken the normal way. It dragged on as a stubborn argument between two realities. The attackers' belief that time would kill the defenders, and the defenders' belief that the night could kill the attackers' confidence faster than time could kill theirs. Inside the perimeter, the defenders lived in a world reduced to essentials: heat, dust, flies, and the brutal equality of bombardment. A man learned to recognize aircraft types by the sound that arrived seconds before the bombs. He learned to sleep in pieces. He learned to eat without appetite. He learned that the most valuable thing in a siege is not food or water, but a mind that can still choose, because choice is what prevents you from becoming prey. The port mattered because it was the garrison's lifeline. Supplies and reinforcements did not arrive by magic. They arrived because ships ran the gauntlet. The link to the outside world became a nightly gamble across the sea, and it gave the siege its second battlefield, one fought by sailors and small warships as much as by infantry in trenches. Some ships did not come back. The garrison stayed alive because the sea route did not fully break during the period when it mattered most, even as losses mounted, and every run felt like pushing a finger through a closing door. The sea route also did something psychological. It reminded the defenders they were not abandoned. In sieges, abandonment kills faster than shells. While the sea kept the fortress breathing, the land war kept the legend growing. The night patrol economy did not end because it was glamorous. It continued because it worked. A siege is an argument about stamina. Patrolling turned it into an argument about nerves. Every night raid was a message sent in the only language the besiegers could not censor, the language of consequences: a missing sentry, a cut wire, a raided post, a prisoner dragged back through the dark, a burst of sudden violence followed by silence, so complete the enemy wondered if he imagined it. This is the point where fear becomes self-sustaining. Once a besieging force starts believing the defenders own the night, the besiegers begin acting like the night is hostile even on quiet evenings. They stand too longer. They waste flares. They exhaust themselves. They begin treating harmless noises as threats and real threats as background. They do the defenders' work for them by wearing themselves down, but the defenders also paid. The Australians in Tobruk suffered significant casualties over the campaign period, killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. The siege was not a legend built from cleverness alone. It was built from men who did not come home and from bodies that stayed in desert soil. That cost matters because it prevents the story from becoming mythic propaganda. This was not fear as entertainment. It was fear purchased at a real human price. Eventually, the composition of the garrison changed as units were relieved in stages. Relief in a siege is never a clean handoff. It is a surgical transfer conducted under threat. Some units remained longer than others. Some were there at the beginning and still there when the siege finally lifted. In the memory of those who lived it, time in Tobruk compresses into a single long sensation: dust, noise, and the nightly decision to keep being dangerous. The siege was lifted later in 1941, not because the besiegers suddenly became incompetent, but because the wider campaign shifted and the ring broke. That is how most sieges truly end, through the movement of the broader war rather than through the neat logic of the siege itself. But what mattered culturally was not only that Tobruk survived. It was how it survived. The garrison didn't just hold. It insulted the logic of the siege by refusing to become passive. That refusal did something strategic beyond Tobruk. It forced the Axis to allocate attention and resources to a problem that should have been solved quickly. It also gave the Allies, in one of the war's dark early phases, a story that worked. A story of a fortress that did not fall, of men who took an insult and turned it into pride, of a perimeter that did not simply endure pressure, but pushed back with its own pressure. And that is the final link to the title, why fear attached itself to Australians in German memory in a different way. British forces could be terrifying through system and weight, artillery, disciplined formations, professional defense, and later the cumulative grind of the Eighth Army. American forces would become terrifying through industrial scale, mass, machines, air power, and an ability to keep feeding the battlefield faster than the Axis could. Those are fears of visible power. The Australians' most famous Mediterranean reputation in 1941, especially around Tobruk, was built on a different kind of power. The power of making the enemy feel unsafe in the most private hours of the day. The power of the night patrol. The power of refusal. The power of unpredictable aggression that didn't always seek a big battle, but sought a long-term psychological effect. And Greece and Crete deepened that reputation in a separate way. Greece showed Germans that Australians could fight effective local actions even inside a retreat, that rearguards could be stubborn and professional, that the withdrawal did not automatically mean collapse of fighting spirit. Crete showed German airborne troops and mountain troops that victory could be bought at a savage cost when defenders refused to panic and fought close. In groves and creek beds and narrow roads, where modern war's big machines mattered less than the will to close distance and finish fights. So the combined lesson of 1941 is this: Australians did not frighten Germans because they were mystical. They frightened Germans because they were often aggressive in the spaces where soldiers most want stability, at night in the gaps, at the edge of routine, inside the places a man tells himself are safe. This is where the documentary ends, not with a slogan, but with a principle that survives every era of war. An army can endure bombardment if it still believes it controls its own choices. An army begins to break when it loses its sense of control over time, when it cannot rest, cannot predict, cannot feel safe even when it has done everything right. That is what the night war steals. And that is why, in the desert and in the islands of the Mediterranean in 1941, some German soldiers spoke about Australians with a particular edge in the voice. Not because Australians were the only enemy worth fearing, but because they created a kind of fear that is harder to fight than bullets. The fear that the enemy is nearby, patient, and waiting for the moment you relax.